another episode of Gov Tech Today. I'm Russell Lowery.
And I'm Jen Saha.
And together we're going to try and help bridge the gap between .com and .gov. Perhaps that gap is never more broad than the frustration that some of our .com friends feel over the terms and conditions in the procurement technology contracts. But we've talked about reform in the past, but there is a specific comment period that's open now, and there was a big hearing recently where industry and the government came together to try and hammer some of these things out. And so, Jen, I was there. I know you played a big role in that process. Hopefully add some value for our listeners about what's going on. So are there changes afoot? Are there going to be changes in the procurement space?
I mean, there are definitely going to be changes. It's crafting those changes so that they're favorable for both the government and the vendor community. That is sort of that narrow line that we're all trying to walk here. I mean, this is definitely an effort that's been going on for many years now. I feel like I dream about these terms and conditions at night, and unfortunately know them very well, can probably recite sections of them. But, you know, it really narrows down to focus on a few pain points, a few areas that are like, hey, our attorneys always question X. And so those are really what the comments at the session with DGS and CDT attorneys at the table, what those comments from the vendor community really narrowed in on.
I'm confess to being less familiar with the terms and conditions, being newer in this space, and just taking the questions we get when we're talking to potential resale partners and that sort of thing, and thinking through and talking to some other small and disabled veteran-owned businesses and saying, okay, how is this going to help or hinder our ability to do business? And so I was looking and we submitted comments in that vein. And there was some overlap between because the big guys had concerns about it, it impacts our ability to either work with them or resell. So how would you characterize, what were some of the biggest concerns that you saw at the hearing?
Well, first of all, there's a lot of confusion. There's different versions of this, right? I have the IT general provisions, and then I have software as a service, special provisions. And then I have infrastructure as a service and platform as a service special provisions. There's a lot of overlap in all three of these documents. So the first thing that DGS and CDT did is combine the software as a service and infrastructure/platform as a service into one set of terms and conditions. There is still a lot of overlap between that new set, the cloud set, if you will, and the on-prem or just general set. A lot of the same sections you see appear in both, but then anything that appears specifically in the cloud stuff is for cloud procurements. I think when you break it down that way, it's a lot more clear to the state departments and agencies as to which ones they should be using. I mean, I've seen them be like, we need all three of these. And I'm like, no, you don't. Like, that doesn't make any sense. And they're like, we want to play it safe. Let's just put all three of them on there. And so the more clear and less confusing you can make it for the state departments and agencies, the more the vendors appreciate it. So that was a big win, I think, for the vendor community and the state. There's still issues around liability. The state of California, in their 401 IT general provisions, has really good limitations on liability. If something goes sideways, I, as a company, am responsible for a liability up to the amount of the contract. So it's like 1 times the contract amount. This is pretty good. In other states, it's 2 times, 3 times, you could be 5 times. So that's fine.
I heard a different response from the state. I heard, we're not discussing this, and the the liability is not going to get changed, and we need more protection than what you're saying, because the risk is greater than the cost of the contract, and we need protection for that. So it might be a $1 million contract, but if they've got a lot of proprietary data, they've got a lot of personally identifiable data, if you do something that compromises all of that data, they want, and it's expensive, or they want the full cost of what that repair might be.
Everything. Yeah. Mediate it. Check people's credit for a year if there's a breach of information. There's all kinds of the problem. And you're right. The problem with that 1X liability is there are a lot of carve outs. There are a lot of, your liability is 1X. Except, and it lists all of these things. One of those areas is cybersecurity.
Right.
And in the case of a breach, which it happens for sure, California is one of only 2 states that actually require the vendor to fund credit monitoring for anyone involved. If it's more than 500 people, you have to report it to the AG. There's all kinds of, if it happens, you have to do all of these things. But nowhere in there is it like up to X dollar amount or, times 5X. And I get it. Like the comment was made, California is a really big state. Some of these breach mitigations could cost millions and millions of dollars. But that's the point of making it a multiplier of the contract amount, right? Like 5X for a $100 million contract in the state of California is a lot more than 5X for maybe a $5 million contract in the state of Idaho. So, I mean, by making it a multiplier, I feel like you kind of capture for that vast population that is California. But you're right. Like, there's going to have to be more discussions. A lot of the big companies are unwilling to sign onto a contract that has unlimited liability. And all of those, except for wins, mean ultimately liability is unlimited.
I know we have advocates who listen to the show, and I'm talking to people who were there at the event. I think I'm a pretty good government listener, and I just heard clearly that's not changing. And I know it's so important. It's important to a lot of people, some of our resale partners. I just didn't get the sense that the state was going to bend on that point. So as you that doesn't mean people will give up pushing for it and explaining to the state why it's costing them a lot more money, because it might be good if maybe explain to our listeners why it costs the government more money as the same widget. Because the liability is greater, you pay a lot more. The cost of that liability isn't free. It's written into the cost of the thing you're procuring.
Sure. Companies bid and price their goods and services based on the risk that they are assuming for any contract. That risk is infinite when liability is unlimited.
Right.
And so you better believe they're going to make it more expensive, because in the off chance that something does happen, they have to protect themselves. Some big companies aren't willing to do it.
Right.
I think what's going to make the difference and what's going to really drive home the need for this with the administration, and what I really appreciated about you speaking up, and there were a couple other small businesses that spoke up. The government has very aggressive small business goals. It's a huge focus of this administration. So when a small business raises their hand and says, I can't bid on this because my livelihood is literally on the line.
Right. What
you've constructed here has shut out small businesses from being willing to take those risks for, a $1 million contract. That's huge, right? That funds your operations for a couple years. But that unlimited liability will put you out of business and sometimes put you on the street.
Yeah, we didn't have a conversation much at the hearing. But one of the things I found is everyone hates the small business or DVBE that's simply a pass through. There's no commercial useful function. They're just a bid pass through. Well, this liability rule is the number one reason I think that those companies exist, because they know that the company's not worth what the state's going to come after. So they'll take all of that liability, and they're fine to bid 1 or 2% margin type of things, because if it ever comes down, they'll just shut down and go away, and there's no there. So the state's paying an inflated price, but they're not getting in any way a better product. They're just facilitating that expense to a pass-through entity who exists to bear risk that's never going to pay off. They're signing it, but the state's not going to collect that.
I've seen it happen where you get these fly-by-the-night companies. Maybe you have a storefront we don't even know that are willing to take on this risk. And then they're out of business 6 months later. And, we're just going to contract with a subcontractor who's like a multi-billion-dollar company or something going from there on out. But it is a risk, and you have to look at it from the state's perspective. Are you really getting the best product, the best service that you want when you have these companies that could be very fly-by-the-night? They're just willing to take the risk, so we'll hire them, versus capping this, but in the end, having a better quality product at a better price. There is definitely a balance in what the state is willing to assume when it comes to risk and what they're going to get if they look at this in the long run.
There were, as interesting as that one is, there were other topics that were raised, and we'll delve into a few of those. I don't know if any of your clients were concerned, but the issue of title comes up when I'm dealing with small new publishers of software, and the state goes pretty aggressively. They're not just buying the use; they're getting a right to the title of the product that is not common in other contracts. Has that issue come up for
it's definitely come up, that and, intellectual property, companies wanting to protect themselves, their source code, that type of thing. I think that the government asks the vendor community to keep a lot private, and the vendor community is fine with that because it's very private information. And what they ask for is for the state to do the same, right? We'll show you everything, but you have to keep it private. That's sort of where they've landed when it comes to how much a company might be willing to share. It is very common in government contracts that they do want you to sort of sign over everything, and it's all government property now. But it is a tough pill to swallow, especially for, those smaller companies, or maybe they've never done work in governments. And now it's like,
you want to give me what?
Right, wait a minute. What? Right. Excuse me?
I think it's going to prevent us from getting some of the latest and greatest technology because companies that are coming up that are fast growth, born in California, maybe exploding in the private sector, are just not familiar, comfortable, or willing to take on that risk as they transfer it to the state. And so I was hoping to get a little movement on that based on the interaction. I didn't expect it, and I didn't hear it echoed back throughout the community. So that's where I thought asking.
Really the downside there is you're discouraging innovation, right? I think it's one of the factors that plays into government technology being roughly 5 years behind the rest of it, because by the time those guys are willing to work with the government and accept these, that technology is from years ago. We finally figured out how to work within the government confines, but it's going to be a while, right? So you're not going to get cutting edge in your government with these set terms and conditions because cutting edge isn't willing to bend on them.
Right. And so we've got some provisions that bar the new up and coming American-based companies, but we also had some provisions, particularly with regard to the data access when you have a globally integrated company and they've got employees in dozens of countries, and there's provisions that suggest that only Americans can handle the data. And so exploring whether there could be some flexibility in that where a U.S. person based in a foreign country could have access to the data as people move, as we work from home, as we've got globally distributed workforces. It can be a hard position to advocate before the government, because it sounds like, okay, how do I export as many jobs as possible to low wage countries, and you just let me do it,
Right.
But if you've got a U.S. person, or it enables a smaller company to compete because we can source talent, how can we protect data? And it wasn't clear to me how, whether or not the person was a U.S. citizen or not, or where they were particularly located was the factor.
So this is one of those policy decisions that impacts price, right?
Right.
Same thing with a DVBE carve out or a small business carve out. You may be paying more, but it's going to a small business, and that's a policy we support. So government is okay with that. Same kind of thing here. You say, buy American. We don't want any jobs outside of the continental United States. The data has to stay in America. They're going to be charged more. Like, that's the bottom line. You have all of these guys, they've got to build data centers in the United States where maybe they didn't have one before. They're going to have to charge you higher labor rates because the US labor rates are a lot more than India or anywhere overseas. So it's a policy decision that's been made. They do have the backing, although I'm not sure there's like a ton of evidence behind this of the safety of keeping data in the United States. I've even seen where people have said, what about Canada? Like, they're our friends. It's fine. They're right over the border. No go, United States only. So there are some questions. What if I'm a contractor and I go on vacation in the Caribbean and I have my work cell phone with me? That could be a problem in some instances.
Right.
There's a lot of questions around it. Ultimately, it's buy American, support our economy. At the foundation of it, it's an effort to protect our data, ? And keep those jobs here, regardless of if it's at a higher cost to government.
Well, I think rules surrounding protecting the data, access to it, all of that makes sense. Where it's housed, and you set the rules. You don't have to set that detail of parameter. I think you're getting an expense that may not be worth it. But
totally.
We'll see how that goes. One of the ones that was causing a big headache is the rules around security. It's a big topic in the government. There's a lot of money in state government for both storing and securing data, but some of the definitions in the proposed regulations are creating confusion or could move us in the wrong direction. What are you seeing in that space that has you and your clients concerned?
Confusion. You hit the nail on the head. How we're defining a breach, how we're defining the needs for notifications, who's getting those notifications and by what means, and what timelines. So as written, it's a 48-hour notification. What if you find out at 5 p.m. on a Friday? You can't meet that 48-hour. Those guys aren't in the office until Monday. So there are a lot of question marks around that. And I think unattainable goals that we'll go back to, and they even said it in there, like this has been in our terms and conditions for years. No one's ever said anything. And part of me wanted to be like, they just sign it, like they don't read it, and they don't know if they can comply with that. I'm not sure that there are many companies out there that can honestly say in good faith and be completely forthright that they could always hit a 48-hour notification or always hit a 99.9% uptime, which is also
Right.
in the terms and conditions as drafted. They can hit it. It's going to cost you a lot more. So do you really want them to hit it, or is like 96% okay at, this much lower rate? I just think that there's so much wiggle room that needs to be sort of established in these for them to fit a case-by-case basis.
The one that got me was the suspected breach. And sometimes getting notified of a potential or a suspected breach could just overwhelm. Okay, false, false, false. It's like the boy who cried wolf. And instead of reacting when there's a certain level, you're just getting constantly notified, so that when it's really a breach notification that needs to go out, a suspect breach, that you get everyone's attention. And it wasn't clear to me that I was reading faces as we were bringing up the comments, and I wasn't sure we were landing, so it might take a few follow-up calls and meetings to really press that home. You may be getting more information than is helpful.
Yeah, for sure. I don't care about a suspected breach. Like, call me when you know if it's real or not,
Right.
and if it impacted me, right? Like,
Right.
that's the general kind of mindset, I think, as a citizen. And you would hope that a lot of that would carry into the state's terms and conditions as well. I mean, I think something that's important is, like, we are not the first state to write cybersecurity breach notification requirements. We are not the first state to struggle with liability as an issue. We are not the first state to deal with any of these issues. So I really love the idea, and I'm not sure how much of this has been done, of looking at other states or the federal government. Like, certainly if it's okay for the feds, it should be okay for us in California. You talk about size of the economy, they're bigger. So I like the idea of really comparing what we have in this latest draft with what some other large economies have, and seeing how it stacks up, seeing how it's being done in other states or other governments that is more acceptable and more palatable. I mean, I do appreciate throughout the latest draft of the terms and conditions, the term "unless otherwise stated" in the scope of work. Like, that gives you, and DGS recognizes right away, that gives you some wiggle room, right? Like, you can work with a department and you can say, hey, these general terms and conditions, like this 48-hour breach thing, it's not going to work. Like, I can't hit that. We need 72 hours, or we need 5 business days, whatever it is. And departments do have the ability on their case-by-case basis to write something else in.
Well, there's a couple things where I think small businesses could be competitively disadvantaged. One, people could game that breach notification ruling by, you make your product look more secure by just reporting fewer breaches. So the definition is a little fuzzy, and one competitor takes a position that we're going to interpret it this way, and another one is more conservative, and all of a sudden their product, hey, I had this product installed and I got suspected breaches all the time, but I installed this other one and it didn't blow up my inbox. Well, ultimately what they care about is breaches, but the hassle factor could skew it. But as far as where small businesses run into trouble, I would love it if the terms and conditions that I agree with DGS were, I struggle to come up with, understand that. I have to send everything to my lawyer, and we're paying $400 an hour to make sure we comply with everything. And then we have to renegotiate with an agency,
I know.
and they rewrite the whole thing. And sometimes DGS doesn't agree with what the agency is asking me to do, and they're asking me to do contrary things, and it just makes it. And I'm just wind up saying yes to everything. Give it to Mikey; he'll eat anything.
Yeah.
Is that how to? it just seems like companies of a size and scale with in-house lawyers that are dealing with this in 50 states and are comfortable exchanging the paper back and forth are in a more advantageous position than small businesses who are trying to navigate this.
For sure. I do think that there's the opportunity, and what I would really hope for is that these base general terms and conditions establish a minimum level of protection that everyone has to meet no matter what your project is within the state. And then if a department needs to add more because something is special there, we're dealing with PII, or, we are going to require a FedRAMP certification on this, they can add that on. Like, we shouldn't start at the top with being super restrictive and say, oh, you can peel it back. No, we should start with like a floor. Everyone has to meet these basic things, and then you can add on if you need to for your given data usage model, whatever it may be. I mean, that's the hope, and that's how I've seen it done in other states. You have your general T's and C's that are fairly benign, easy to meet, and then on top of that is where the departments are saying, we're doing something special here, we need this.
That sounds like a wonderful system. It doesn't sound like the direction where we're sitting today, but what's the timeline as we wrap this up? What's the timeline that you expect, and how, if people want to get engaged, what does the opportunity look like?
So DGS on their procurement webpage has information about how you can submit comments. I literally sent like a red line of the current terms and conditions, and you can send them things, have questions back and forth with the team that's looking at this. It is a lot of attorneys, and I've always found I love the profession, but it's easier to say no than to say yes and let's figure it out. So trying to get them in that yes mindset is the challenge that all of us have. But I think they are accepting comments on this through March 18th. And then they are going to take all those comments back, share them with everybody, so we'll be able to see what everyone says, and then come out with new terms and conditions, hopefully within a couple months.
That sounds like a wonderful timeline. And by that point, I will have read through them. I won't be at Saha level, but having read through them and digest, hopefully it gives people a roadmap that allows them to do business with the state.
Let's hope so.